Well, hello everyone, and welcome to a Net Zero Watch webinar on COP27. What does it mean for international climate policy? Thank you for joining us wherever you are. We've had lots of international interest in our webinar this evening, and or whatever time it is where you are. And this is a very important conversation. COP27, certainly from a British perspective, hasn't been quite as much in the press over here as Glasgow was last year, but it's certainly thrown up a lot of important questions, and the international policy implications of the conference will be closely studied. And with me to analyze these questions today is a wonderful panel. We're very grateful to get such esteemed panelists with us today. Firstly, Professor Jun Arima, who's joining us from Japan at 3 a.m. where he is. So he's very keen to talk about this important subject, and we're very grateful that he's stayed up to talk to us about this. He's a professor, if you don't know already, of energy and environment policy at the University of Tokyo, and he has many accolades to his name. But perhaps most important in this context is his role as a lead negotiator for Japan at previous climate summits at Kyoto, and then famously in COP16 in Cancun. He said that under no conditions or circumstances would Japan join Kyoto 2, and that really was an important moment, and it pushed the focus of climate negotiations away from the focus on emissions targets and to a temperature-based approach, eventually, as it would be, that culminated in Paris. Now, with COP27, we're looking at more the implications of how that's delivered. And so it's been a fascinating conference from that perspective to really see how, now that the ambition level has been set, where the negotiations are going, because it's getting into the nitty-gritty of how this ambition can actually be achieved. So we're very much looking forward to hearing from him. We've got Mario Loyola, who's an assistant professor at the Florida International University and a director of environmental finance and risk management program there. And he's worked on environmental policy and regulatory issues for many years, both in and out of government. He's worked at the White House and advising the Pentagon and in the US Senate. You may well know him from the Competitive Enterprise Institute, and he publishes frequently in The Atlantic, the National Review, and in addition to academic and policy journals. And he's just been at COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh as well. And he has been doing some work with the Volo Foundation, which promotes science-based climate solutions. So it'd be interesting to hear from him about what kind of positive climate policies, given that I can imagine that there'll be certainly plenty to criticize. So it would be interesting to hear from him a bit more about what would a more sensible approach to climate policy look like. And finally, we've got Rupert Darwall, who's a long-standing friend of the GWPF. He's written a number of excellent reports for us and for Net Zero Watch, including the Anti-Development Bank, which is looking at the World Bank's regressive energy policies, and also the Climate Change Act at 10, and Climate News, Business Net Zero, and the IPCC's anti-capitalistic approach. He's written a fantastic book called Green Tyranny, and he also writes regularly in the international press. So we're delighted he's joining us this evening. So without further ado, just to go over some housekeeping, you will see at the bottom, you should see a question and answer panel. Please, everyone who's watching in, submit your questions to the question and answer panel, and I'll be looking at those later to decide which questions we put to our panelists. There's also a chat function. Feel free to communicate between yourselves, but I'll be looking at the question and answer panel when I decide which questions I'll be asking today. So without further ado, I'd like to invite Professor Jun Arima to make his opening remarks. Jun, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Harry, for your kind introduction. And I have just come back from COP27, and let me share my perspective. But before talking about COP27, I'd like to start with the implication of the Ukraine war to climate change agenda. And as you know, Russia's invasion to Ukraine has caused the price hike of the fossil fuel and also price hike of food, and world economy is going downturn to stagflation, and a stable and affordable energy supply has become the top priority in many countries. And of course, climate change is regarded as utmost priority in such fora as G7 and COP27, of course. But in reality, there are many inconvenient truths contrary to climate mitigation. For example, in China and India and other countries have increased coal production and coal-fired power generation since before the war in Ukraine. And rising natural gas prices in Asia is hampering coal to natural gas switching. So it is increasing or extending the lifetime of the coal. And even developed countries are very much busy dealing with soaring energy prices. And Japan is not an exception. The Japanese government has introduced a price subsidy for gasoline, and it is introducing price subsidy for electricity to curb the price hike. So this shows how vulnerable the developing democratic countries' governments are to the price hike of the indispensable energy for daily life and also industrial activity. And we had a G7 Elmhurst Summit in Germany, and they made a very strong commitment to the Glasgow Climate Pact, which is worked out in COP26. But G20 leaders' declaration is much weaker in terms of the strength and mitigation. At COP27, emerging economies such as China, India, and Saudi Arabia try to water down a 1.5 degrees language. And in the end, mitigation language in Sharm el-Sheikh implementation plan is not has not gone beyond Glasgow. Because of the Ukraine war, unfortunately, world is going towards divided world, and this could have a very much negative impact to global endeavor for combating climate change, because the agenda of climate change has emerged, simultaneously with the end of Cold War. And expansion of military spending by Western countries could crowd out its financial assistance to developing countries. And given that the NDCs by developing countries is conditional to the provision of financial assistance by developed countries, then that could further delay the mitigation action by developing countries. And in addition, my feeling is that developing countries are increasingly frustrated with some sort of double standard by Western countries, where on one hand, Western countries are, say, procuring coal and LNG by all means for securing their own energy security. But on the other hand, they are discouraging fossil-related investment in developing countries on the ground that it is contrary to climate mitigation. And this could further exacerbate the division of the world. And the imposition of extremely ideological and anti-fossil policy by Western countries could further strengthen China's influence in developing countries. And that is not the interest of many democratic states like EU, Japan, and the US. And China is actually taking very much windfall profit by exporting PV and panels and batteries and EVs to developed countries aiming at carbon neutrality, and exporting coal-fired power to developing countries which still needs coal resources. And by procuring cheap Russian oil and gas, China's energy security position is even strengthened. So under that situation, COP27 has been held. So my summary of COP27 is first, it was in Glasgow, it was a victory of developed country or UK chair by pushing a very much ambitious temperature target, 1.5 degrees, going beyond Paris Agreement. But 1 year later, in Sharm el-Sheikh, COP27, it was complete victory by developing countries. And in this COP, developed countries have been pursuing a very much ambitious mitigation action plan as agreed in Glasgow Climate Pact. But on the other hand, developing countries were pursuing loss and damage fund and other financial arrangement. And outcome of this negotiation was the establishment of the loss and damage fund was agreed upon. On the other hand, as for mitigation, there was no progress from Glasgow. And for example, developed country wanted to have something like a PDCA cycle, a mitigation action plan, so that NDC can be upgraded, say, more frequently than 5-year cycle as stipulated in Paris Agreement. And naturally, developing countries are praising the COP27 as a historic COP. But developed countries are very disappointed. And I heard the closing remarks by Minister Sharma, the COP26 chair, and he said, we came here to make a progress from Glasgow Climate Pact, but actually we had to defend the line of Glasgow, and many some parties tried to water down or backslide from the agreed line in Glasgow Climate Pact. And we do not have 2025 to peak out. We do not have coal phase out. We do not have fossil fuel phase out. And so that was a bitter disappointment on the side of developed countries, in particular, say, EU and US, I think. And from the beginning, I have been considering that the loss and damage fund and ambitious mitigation action plan would be treated as a package deal. But outcome was a complete victory on the side of developing country. Why? I was a bit puzzled. Possible explanation could be the chair country Egypt belonging to African state, and African countries were putting very much emphasis on loss and damage. And second, this COP27 is a peculiar COP, which is held under Ukraine war. And there is big concern among environmentalists that ongoing war could put climate change agenda at the lower priority. So it was completely impossible for them to leave COP27, say, a complete failure. So if developed country reject the demand from developing countries claiming for the creation of loss and damage fund, then developed country will be harshly criticized by developing country as well as environmental circles. So I think that was a lot of developed countries side, which is very much afraid of complete, say, the burst of the COP27. And this COP also showed the inherent problems of the Glasgow Climate Pact, because Glasgow Climate Pact had some sort of intention to override Paris Agreement, while Paris Agreement had a temperature goal to, say, contain the temperature increase well below 2 degrees, and if possible 1.5 degrees. But Glasgow Climate Pact highlighted 1.5 degrees Celsius target. And while Paris Agreement was talking about carbon neutrality in the second half of this century, but Glasgow Climate Pact, say, aimed at 2050 carbon neutrality globally. And while Paris Agreement had a clear timeline, so every 5 years revision of the NDC, but by inserting the idea of ambitious mitigation action plan, they try to insert more frequent revision cycle or review cycle of the mitigation target. And my sense is, in particular, emerging economies like China, India, and Saudi Arabia had a bitter feeling about this Glasgow Climate Pact. So this year, in such fora as G20, whenever this issue was raised, those countries tried to water down or even rejected the reference to 1.5 degrees or Glasgow Climate Pact. And also, I sense that there is growing frustration among developing countries about anti-fossil fuel posture by developed countries such as the US and EU. And when India interestingly proposed the phase down of unabated fossil fuel instead of unabated coal, and EU supported Indian proposal, and that was a very strange coalition between EU and India. But India's intention was quite clear to me because India was very much frustrated by, say, finger pointing to only coal, their primary energy resources, while European countries are using natural gas as a bridging fuel. So though they are, say, supporting phase down of unabated fossil fuel power as a whole, their intention was completely different. And that is my interpretation. And also, in this COP, developing countries demanded developed countries to achieve carbon neutrality by 2030, not 2050. And it is also very much well anticipated because developed countries pushed for 2050 carbon neutrality globally. So from the viewpoint of developing countries, it is quite natural that they demand much earlier carbon neutrality and much bigger financial assistance from developed countries. And those things exactly happened in COP27. And finally, I think, ironically, the environmentalists of developed countries are always attributing every, say, extreme weathers to global warming problems. And now that claim is utilized by developing countries as the justification of loss and damage claim. And it could be an endless invoice from developing countries to developed countries. But on the other hand, I think developing countries must be very much victorious after this COP27. But I sense they will be also disappointed in years to come, because how that wallet could be fulfilled. Look at the current financial target. 100 billion US dollars has not been achieved yet. And according to the UNFCCC Secretariat Census report, the financial needs for mitigation and adaptation towards 2030 amounts to 5.8, 5.9 trillion US dollars. And there is a huge gap between 100 billion US dollar and 5.8, 5.9 billion trillion US dollar. And loss and damage, the financial needs for responding to loss and damage perhaps will not be included in this amount because completely different, say, nature of financial needs. And also, according to this decision, loss and damage fund needs to be financed by new and additional finance by developed countries. So how we can achieve such a mobilization of finance? So perhaps I think they have succeeded in creating a wallet, but that wallet could be empty. So in summary, I think ongoing negotiation could be characterized by impossible temperature target, that is 1.5 degree target, and endless invoice, endless demand from developing countries for financial resources. And now they have got a loss and damage. So in the years to come, developed countries will receive endless demand from developing countries first to accelerate already impossible carbon neutrality goals and impossible financial assistance to developing countries. So I cannot see any, how can I say, landing ground. So where this ongoing negotiation will go? So perhaps this COP27 has opened somehow the Pandora's box of huge financial assistance demand from developing countries. So something like an UNCTAD. So maybe I think this COP27 could be remembered as a beginning of the end of the COP process. So I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jun. I think the beginning of the end is a great quote to finish on there as a way of sort of understanding what this COP27 might mean. So thank you very much for your remarks there, and I'm sure we'll hear more from you later when we move on to questions. And next, I'd like to introduce Mario Loyola to make his opening remarks. Mario, over to you.
Thank you, Harry, and great informative comments, Professor Arima. And if it's not the beginning of the end, as your great countrymen Harry and Rupert once said, it's at least the end of the beginning. So that was somewhat in evidence as well. And I would say one thing that I thought was curious about this COP is that there was a lot of quite a lot of realism sort of underneath the surface, almost lurking about discreetly underneath the surface behind all the messianic appeals. And it reminded me that it reminded me of a problem that communism had and that Marxism had, which was that it had a very religious appeal, a very apocalyptic appeal. But at the end of the day, it was not a real religion in the sense that its claims were not about the afterlife. They were about the here and now, and they were subject to proof or disproof. The particular claims of Marxism was that the living conditions of the working class would deteriorate under capitalism and would be better off under communism. It was easy to prove that this was incorrect. And sooner or later, the proof became overwhelming. And so similarly with, I think that this is one of the fallacies that the climate change movement sort of shares in common with socialism, which is that it appeals to this apocalyptic sounding end of the world, save the planet kind of talk. But at the end of the day, it's really just a lot of ornamentation on a basic proposition about marginally increasing flood damage. More than anything else, right? And that should be of concern principally to coastal communities. And I'm concerned. I live in Surfside, Florida, 2 blocks from the beach, and I am concerned. My house is going to get, I'm very concerned that my house is entering into an increased risk of flooding over the next several years and decades compared to what it's been in the last 30, 40 years, 50 years since it was built. And that is certainly something that needs to be taken seriously. But how does it need to be taken seriously? By looking carefully at the National Flood Insurance Program and the fact that it subsidizes coastal development and dramatically increases the potential losses to flood damage through a series of perverse incentives. And I think that there is that kind of realism was sort of peeking through the cracks in the wall at the COP here and there. If you listen to the side events, people weren't coming out and expressing sort of these kinds of denier level doubts about the entire thing, but they were trying to point out to some of the realities involved that that certainly point away from the more messianic approaches. I'll say the reason I open with this point about the messianic approach versus the material claim is that at the end of the day, we are just talking about a cost-benefit analysis, and everything that is proposed by way of climate policy has to pass a basic rational cost-benefit analysis. The messianic claim about saving the planet and so forth has a rhetorical is a rhetorical device, maybe not purposeful, but it has the effect of dialing up the benefit side of the cost-benefit equation to infinity, and that way every cost is justified. But at the end of the day, when people actually see what that means, for example, President Macron proposing a 50-cent gasoline tax hike several years ago, they will vote with their feet and could potentially shut an entire country down, as they did in France. We saw in the space of the last couple of years, candidate Biden going from campaigning on a carbon tax to promising by the middle of the summer of 2021 never to raise the gasoline tax, to promising a few months later to try to suspend the existing gasoline tax. And this is all just caving into the reality, which is that at least in a democracy, maybe a dictatorship can satisfy Greta Thunberg, but a democracy is not the right form of government to do the kinds of policies that some of these folks are proposing. And what we've seen at the COP, unfortunately, is at least with the decision document that emerged at the end, is that the sort of the realist approach that says that these financing mechanisms and mitigation mechanisms and adaptation mechanisms need to be grounded in market rational frameworks. This is unfortunately, as Professor Arima points out, this approach was not the one that was embraced in this particular COP, which went in a different direction, away from the market direction and towards a much more expansive, heavy-handed government-heavy interference in the market, in the world market. And we've seen this evolving since the 90s, right? I mean, if people remember, in the 1990s, in the first 10 years, the early 2000s, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change was proposed, established the Green Environment Fund, or the Green Environment Facility. I mean, it established the Adaptation Fund. These were World Bank type of facilities that were meant to facilitate financing for specific meritorious projects in the developing world. They were small, very modestly financed by comparison with what we're talking about now. And then, unfortunately, in around 2010, they established the Green Climate Fund, which is much more like the IMF than the World Bank in that it funds governments directly. And it's sort of operating climate policy at a much more macroeconomic level, where it's much more difficult to know if it's actually going to have any kind of a real effect, other than to bloat the budgets of countries that should be focusing on developing their own market economies. And that's not the only example, as Rupert Darwall has done such great work exposing. It's not the only example where these climate policies are risking to leave the developing world much worse off than it found it. And so the Loss and Damage Fund is one example where yet another step in the direction of this, what we could call global climate welfare. Now the developing countries come to develop, we shouldn't say developing countries, it's the corrupt elites of developing countries, I should say, that make up in large part many socialist dictatorships that dominate the United Nations, that come hat in hand, cap in hand, asking for now $1.3 trillion. So we see this evolution from the $1 billion facility of the Adaptation Fund and Green Environment Facility to the $100 billion of the Green Climate Fund to the $1.3 trillion now of this fantastical Loss and Damage Welfare Fund, which, by the way, given the fact that the IPCC's own latest assessment report expresses low confidence with respect to every single category of extreme weather being linked to climate change, it'd be of course impossible to establish causation, which is the basic the essence of establishing liability under any kind of tort scheme like the Loss and Damage Fund. And apparently this is going to be some kind of strict liability scheme. And details to be worked out later, but I hope that the developed world governments are going to wake up to the shakedown that began at Sharm el-Sheikh with this Loss and Damage Fund, which I thought to be really, under an appealing label, quite a shameless demand that should be rejected out of hand. And by the way, that with all the effects of welfare would only leave those people worse off, right? Because if you give those people a bunch of free money, these developing countries a bunch of free money, it's going to leave them more dependent on rich countries than they are now. It's going to leave them further divorced from the fundamentals of a flourishing economy and a flourishing society. And so if you have their best interests at heart, this is not the direction that we should be going in. I'll repair to what I've been kind of intimating all along, which is that the right approach to all of these things is one that has to be based on the fundamentals of a market economy. And the more that we get away from the fundamentals of a market economy and a framework that's meant to make the market more resilient to these climate change kinds of risks, the less the chances that we're going to be able to succeed in the end. And again, the example that I come back to is, if you look at where the rubber really meets the road in terms of the of climate risks is the increased risk of flooding in a lot of these flood-prone areas along the coast, and there you have to if you had an actuarially based, if in the United States, for example, you had actuarially priced insurance, eventually the insurance premiums would go up as the data suggests that flood risk is going up, and it would become increasingly more and more expensive to live on the coast. This would sooner or later start drying up the pool of financing for further development on the coast, and it would drive people to safer areas or to build more resilient structures wherever they are. And that very dynamic market-based, right at the margins of climate risk kind of an approach would significantly reduce the amount of property value that's exposed to loss, and the amount and the number of lives and limbs that are exposed to the physical danger of climate change. And instead, and you would think this would be the lowest hanging fruit in the entire realm of climate policy, but it's been almost impossible to change it. We have the National Flood Insurance Program in the United States, which goes in exactly the opposite direction and significantly subsidizes development all along the coast, is single-handedly responsible for the chart that shows increased capital losses due to flood damage, because there's so much more property development has been exposed to flood damage because of these subsidies. And the US political system is incapable of reforming this system on market-based principles, even though this should be a much easier sell than the rest of what's being proposed by way of climate policy. And so I would say that in the years ahead, the challenge will be to help the community that collects together at COP, that's justifiably concerned, and it's very easy to be scared about this kind of stuff, about climate change, and wants to make the world safer from it and more resilient from it. Is going to be very important to keep hammering away at some of the basic realities that a lot of these folks appear to be ignoring. And I'll just list a couple of them and then open the door to what I'm sure to be very fascinating comments from Rupert. But one that I'll point out that I've written about quite a lot is the fact that, as I pointed out at the presentation of the World Economic Outlook of the International Energy Agency at a side event at the COP, the stated policies on which all of these emissions reduction scenarios are based in the World Economic Outlook, at least as far as the United States are concerned, are a total and complete fantasy. These commitments of deploying, a terawatt of renewable energy by 2035, it cannot be done under current law. And people are starting to wake up to the fact. Senator Joe Manchin presented a bill that would have solved a couple of these problems and eased this up. And the bill was killed by, ironically enough, the environmentalist wing of the Democratic Party. And so what you have in the United States is a permitting system that's an absolute straitjacket to any solar project that needs to be built in the West on federal land where the sun shines, transmission line projects, any kind of renewable energy, nuclear, forget about it. If you start now, maybe in your children's lifetime, the thing will go operational after it gets through the decades of permitting hurdles. And so the staggering amount of renewable energy infrastructure that would have to be required to meet the clean energy targets in the United States, these projects can't get 1/10 of the permits that they need in time to start construction by 2030 and in time to go operational by 2035. And governments need to start being, I'm sure hopefully it's not as bad in other countries. I know that in Australia, they have a much faster system for issuing these permits. But this is something that people at agencies like the International Energy Agency need to start taking a close look at the impact of these permitting systems on the country's ability to meet these renewable energy targets. I will also point out that the renewable energy targets themselves are based on fantastical assumptions about the effects of intermittency on an overall grid. In California, right, and I'll say that in the United States, there was an attempt last year to foist a renewable electricity performance program that would have as its target 80% renewables on the electricity grid. California right now has achieved 30%, 33% deployment of renewables on its electricity grid. And in the middle of the day, it's discovering that the price of electricity is negative because it has such that represents such an excess of solar power generation in the middle of the day when you don't need it, that the grid operators in California are having to pay people in Arizona to take the electricity from them because they don't know what to do with it. And so there is simply a ratio of renewable to dispatchable baseload generation, and it's maybe 1-to-1, but it's probably more like 1-to-2 that you cannot go beyond and still maintain a reliable grid. And so what that means, whenever you hear anybody talking about 80% renewable energy, what they're really talking about is a spectacular excess of renewable power on the grid, which means that the prognostications of how much renewable you need are much greater than just than just 500 megawatts of solar or 500 gigawatts of solar and so forth. I'll finally close by saying that the anti-fossil fuel jihad continues. It's still one of the religious elements of that you see very pervasive at a thing like the COP. And those folks still have not woken up to the fact that their purposeful constriction of oil supply is achieving exactly the same thing that OPEC is meant to achieve. And it's one of the factors that has helped to make Saudi Aramco the world's most valuable company, and which is producing the windfall profits that are driving them crazy. They think that Joe Biden appears to think that it's greed. In fact, it's his own policies that are producing these windfall profits. All of the problems that I just mentioned are much worse in the developing world, where, as Rupert has pointed out in his great work on the anti-development rank, just criticizing the new climate framework for World Bank facilities, this is now siphoning away crucially needed development assistance from stuff that actually helps people to stuff that doesn't. And the example is very intuitive. $1 spent on a coal plant can actually help a village. $1 spent on a solar plant delivers a much smaller fraction of electricity and is much more complicated to maintain as part of any grid. In fact, natural gas is orders of magnitude more complicated with a pipeline system and so forth to maintain than coal. And so all of these renewable energy kinds of expectations of the developing world are based on really fatally flawed and fatally uninformed assumptions about how difficult it is to maintain these kinds of renewables as part of a stable grid. And so anyway, I'll leave it there. I hope that I still maintain hope that that market rationality and just common sense can win the day at the COP. But the trend over the past decade or so has not been good. I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that, Mario. I think you raised a key question just at the end there, which is how is the development of developing countries in the future going to happen if it's based off of renewables rather than fossil fuels? That's never been achieved anywhere. And so it's a huge gamble that this is somehow now going to be achieved, despite the fact that all the countries which have secured high level of development have done so using fossil fuels. I'm sure that's a theme we'll come back to shortly. But firstly, I'd like to introduce our final panelist, Rupert Darwall. So over to you.
We're unmuted. Thank you very much, Harry. And first of all, I'd like to congratulate my fellow panelists for going to COP27. I've been to a number of COPs, and on the whole, I found them quite gruesome affairs. Notably, the one in Marrakesh, which the 2016 COP in Marrakesh, where I got arrested by the UN police, who I can tell you are a lot less pleasant individuals than the Moroccan police, who were actually incredibly civil and rather apologetic. But I think the big point I think is worth making is that this whole process is the UN FCCC process is actually, as Professor Jun Arima has intimated, is a failure and has been a failure. And so if you just look at some data that in the 22 years leading up to the Rio Earth Summit and the convention, the signing of the convention in Rio, global carbon dioxide emissions rose by 50%. In the 22 years after the signature of the convention, their growth accelerated from 50% in those 22 years to 62%. There is nothing in the data that shows that this process is successful. And you don't have to look at the data or take my word for that. There's an incredibly powerful presentation given by William Nortax to the European Central Bank in October last year. So this is before the Glasgow COP, where he made a very similar point. He said this process is a failure, and he basically argued that the right thing to do was to give up on the COP process and form a club of developed nations who do two things. They impose a carbon tax, uniform carbon tax of $50 a ton, and secondly, they have carbon tariffs of non-compliant of people who don't join, nations who don't join the club. I think it's a 5% from memory, 5% tariff. And what he was harking back to was the model that had worked with the ozone layer and the Montreal Protocol of 1987. And that is, many people would say, is the most successful environmental treaty there's ever been. And why was this a success? It was a success because it was done outside the UN process. And so as the Montreal Protocol was taking place, what you had happening in the UN General Assembly was a move to take global warming and make it a UN process. And the reason why a UN process is basically never going to work is it has to work by consensus. It's not about majorities, it's not about, and it therefore is very slow moving. The first COP I went to was the Paris COP, and there was shortly before the Paris COP, Maurice Strong died. Maurice Strong is a very interesting man. He was not the architect, he was the impresario, I should say, of the Rio Summit in 1992, and he was the UN point man for the Stockholm Environmental Conference of 1972. And there was a little to celebrate, to memorialize him. There was a very small and interesting meeting of people who knew Maurice Strong at which was held at the Paris COP. And I remember one thing, one of his aides asked him, who was at the Stockholm conference, said, "What is the policy of this conference? What do you want?" And he said, "The process is the policy." And once you understand that, you understand everything about the UN process. It's not about actually achieving anything. The process is the policy. Keeping the show on the road is the policy. And that's why I think I'm inclined to dissent from the view that this is the beginning of the end, because this is about keeping the process going, and nothing will get in the way of further COPs, further process. I mean, this was a COP that really had very little to decide, yet I think 100 heads of government turned up, including President Biden, Rishi Sunak. I think Justin Trudeau gave it a miss. But it's a process that accretes influence, it accretes money. And in terms of where this is going, I mean, Glasgow was about keeping 1.5 alive. And what I think has been shown by our panelists is that COP27, well, 1.5 looks out of reach. But I'll tell you, it is still in reach. And what will happen is the IPCC will go back. It was the IPCC incidentally, we should remember this, that came up with 1.5 and net zero by 2050. As Professor Jun Arima points out, this wasn't in the Paris Agreement. One of the decisions from that COP was that the IPCC should do a report on 1.5, which it duly did, and it came up with some smoke and mirrors calculations that showed the carbon budget required that net zero be reached in 2050. And so that then got, if you like, rammed into the COP process by the British presidency at the Glasgow COP. But what will happen now is the IPCC will say, well, we've looked at our calculations, and lo and behold, the carbon budget is bigger than we expected. That, I guarantee that will be the next iteration of all this, because the process has to carry on. And I think it will only end when, and this is where the West is in a very weak position, because the West as a whole has invested so much political and economic capital in this process, in decarbonisation, in net zero, that none of the current generation of political leaders will let this go. They have to say the thing has been a success. They have to say, yes, we have a moral obligation to shell out to the Maldives and other low-lying islands that are in peril from inundation. And incidentally, the whole thing about the 1.5 and the small island states, that they're in danger of being swamped by rising seas, is a complete fabrication. And this is something that Charles Darwin understood in the 1830s when he was on the Beagle, and he asked himself, how is it coral atolls are formed? And his hypothesis was by the slow subsidence of the ocean bed, i.e. rising sea levels, actually create these small island states, these small island atolls. So it's actually a complete bunk until a Western leader stands up and says, actually, this is bunk. Small island states are in no danger, or the coral atoll ones in particular are not in danger of inundation. This is just targeting us. Until you have a Western leader that says that, this will continue, and there will be transfers of money to developing nations as the price for keeping this process going.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for that, Rupert. If I might just come in there with a quick question, which is, you were special advisor to the Chancellor of the Exchequer in the past. If you were advising the Prime Minister now, before COP27, when he flip-flopped on the issue of whether to attend COP27, and it created a big hoo-ha in the press. What do you think he should have done? Should he have not attended at all, or do you think he needed to attend?
I think the thing before that is, I think he could have attended, but what he said would have been very different. But I think before that, what he should have said, and his predecessor, his ill-fated predecessor, who completely missed this, was that they should have said the Ukraine war has changed everything. And that we need to be energy realists. That net zero is contributing to our energy predicament. It is strengthening Vladimir Putin's hand. He's now exploiting the leverage that we have given him, and therefore we need to ask some very serious questions about current energy policy and our commitment to net zero. Whether he goes to the COP and says that, I think, is a secondary issue. But the failure to grasp the reality of the implications of the Ukrainian war on energy, I think, is an enormous strategic missed opportunity, which we will pay a price of. I think, and it's created the illusion, blaming Vladimir Putin for Europe's energy shortages. In their minds, they think, well, once the war in Ukraine is over, which they assume will be early next year, these energy problems are just going to disappear, and they won't. We are into a new era of structurally higher energy prices, and that has very profound economic and strategic implications.
Thank you, Rupert. I think it's very telling that we just saw the same round of apocalyptic warnings at the start. the conference, rather than actually that realism that you were talking about. And it has led to this sort of straitjacket of policy, this repeating process, where we're warned that it's the end of the world. There isn't a realistic approach. And of course, it'll be harder and harder for developing countries and climate activists to accept future COPs when they've been fed this same narrative time and time again, and it finally does bump into reality. And there's going to be a lot of unhappy people because they've been fed this singular message for so long. One word to our attendees: you can actually vote on your favorite questions in the question and answer panel. So do that, and do submit any further additional questions that you may have. So I think firstly, I'd like to ask the question, just going back to that key issue of the loss and damage fund, which we've heard so much about. So if I might ask each panelist, what is the loss and damage fund? And just to explain it a bit to our attendees who may not have heard so much about this before, and a sort of key related question, of course, is who decides how that money is spent, and how is that likely to be decided? Because it's one thing to have the fund, but how you actually spend it is another important question. So Professor Jun Arima, would you like to come in on that first?
Yes, and looking at reading through the decision about loss and damage financial arrangement, it agreed to set up a transition committee, and transition committee is composed by 10 people from developed country and 14 people from developing countries to discuss the governance and TOR and also social finance for say loss and damage fund. So therefore, everything needs to be decided from now. And they are supposed to give recommendations to COP28 by next year by a series of meetings. And who knows the outcome of these recommendations. But the decision-making process is interestingly, again, based on consensus. So even though developing countries outnumber developed country representatives, they cannot dictate decision-making. So maybe that could go into some sort of limbo situation. I don't know. But what puzzled me was for many years, the creating a new funding mechanism like an loss and damage fund. It is something like a compensation mechanism by developed countries to developing countries based on so-called historical responsibility. And it is to say restore the damages which is occurring now. So it is easy for developing countries to claim that that should be paid solely by developed countries. So that's why developed countries were very nervous about the notion of loss and damage. They tried to water down this idea, saying that a loss and damage problem can be dealt with under the, say, umbrella of adaptation rather than creating a new funding mechanism. But now they have made a concession to developing countries. And EU first made a concession to the developing countries by setting certain conditions. But I was very much surprised that why US government say agreed to this sort of proposal. And for many years, that was a red line for the US delegation, not only by Republicans, but also Democrats. So how US delegation could agree on, in principle, establishment of the loss and damage fund? So maybe I could ask a question to Mario.
Yeah, I'm puzzled about that as well. I mean, I can only offer some suspicions. I've been privy to different negotiations in different contexts in which I've seen negotiators from the US in action, and I've always found them to be very professional, very driven by, I would say, an objective, bipartisan or nonpartisan vision of what America's interests are, and very solicitous of American interests, very defensive of American interests. And I think that going back to the Iran nuclear deal, for example, under the Obama administration, there's been an increased willingness to make international undertakings despite the fact that they know of certain knowledge that the other party will reject those undertakings when it's in power the next time around. And I think that it's very damaging to the credibility of the United States to be making such commitments, because even if, I mean, everybody knows that this is never going to get adopted as a treaty, but even for executive agreements, I would hope that for negotiators, regardless of party, that the American delegation would keep in mind that the credibility of America's undertakings matters, and they should not be making undertakings that they know of certain knowledge will be rejected out of hand, and in this case, certainly should be rejected out of hand by any subsequent administration. So I think it's very responsible. Now, what I've heard from people is that there was a united front against this stuff going back several years, but once the EU's, I guess, climate minister Timmerman agreed, the resistance collapsed, and everyone kind of voted with that majority. That's as much as I can offer, I think.
Mario, just a further follow-up to that before we hear from Rupert, which is, how do you deal with true believers while you're at the COP27 or previous COP conferences? Because, when people are refusing to accept any need for fossil fuels in the future and believing in this apocalyptic rhetoric, they might sort of not see your presence there as very welcome at all. Or is it actually the people on the inside do have that level of realism, and that message of doom and gloom is actually for the public? It's not something that they actually necessarily believe themselves. What would you say to that?
Oh, I think that the two are, I came away after the first day thinking that this is like an ice cream sundae in which the two flavors are swirled together, because there are lots of people in a very messianic kind of frame of mind, like you said, and then people from even renewable energy companies and so forth that are more realistic. But I think that if you my basic stance is that you have to start with a basic position of sort of sympathy towards what they are trying to achieve, which I certainly do feel. And you don't have to get. I don't feel a need to get into a lot of, for example, the scientific stuff, or a deep dive into the many questions that the assessment reports leave unanswered. If I just take someone aside who's very committed to achieving a renewable energy grid and is very anti-fossil fuels, I can kind of take them aside and point out, hey, if there's a ratio of 1-to-1 or maybe even 1-to-2 of renewable to dispatchable baseload generation that you can't go beyond and still maintain an efficient grid, and you're going to put electric vehicles on the grid. I mean, this is basically the California situation. You're going to make a rapid transition to electric vehicles. That grid is going to have to expand by, say, 40% in capacity over the next several years. If you're not prepared to, and we cannot permit unless you change the law, that's not going to be filled by the new baseload generation that you need to add is not going to come from nuclear. So if you are not prepared to add, if you're an advocate of renewable energy in California and of electric vehicles, and you are not prepared to add significant new natural gas and maybe even coal generation to the grid, you are essentially taking an anti-renewable energy stance. And you can sort of demonstrate that on a blackboard. This isn't like a normative claim. And so I think that when you approach it that way, and you say, look, what you're really advocating for is energy scarcity. I mean, if you maintain the anti-fossil fuel stance, you're going to make it impossible to deploy renewable energy in sufficient quantities to accommodate electric vehicles on the road. And what you're really talking about is energy scarcity and everyone staying in their gasoline vehicles. I think that it's there's some hope there that people will see the light a little bit more.
Thank you, Mario. And over to you, Rupert. Do you want to pick up on anything you've heard there, or sort of go back to the question of sort of how the loss and damage fund would work?
Yeah, I think the loss and damage is quite interesting because I think it was the Warsaw COP 2013. This got it sort of took off, or first got tabled, and it's taken 9 years to reach this point, which shows how slow the process is. But I think the West is in the, why has the West agreed to this? Why has essentially the EU and the United States agreed to this? It's because they feel impelled to keep the show on the road, that they can't let this process visibly break down. And I think the developing nations understand that very well, which is why they can make these demands and why else they will get some money. I think that the danger of loss and damages, and I understand that there's always an asterisk that this doesn't imply liability, but I think the danger is that you will then see a lot of tort action in the courts in the Netherlands, for example, would be one, probably Germany, perhaps the United States, as suing oil companies. I think that's the big danger. And that will be, I think that will be a large and growing risk. The expropriation of Western oil and gas companies, essentially.
Thank you, Rupert. And if I might come straight back to you again for the next of our audience questions, which has been one of the most popular ones, which is how do we actually get the international media, such as the BBC, to actually talk about a topic like COP27 in that sort of rational, sort of realistic way, as we are doing this evening, rather than this sort of very simplistic, messianic narrative that we're hearing all the time?
Well, I think the answer to that is that won't happen because they're environmental correspondents. This is the high point of their year, and it's COP's like a great big sort of trade festival. It's a trade fair, and it's the high point, and it's also they're incredibly influential, and they do have an impact on how particularly Western states behave. I was very struck, Harry, though, that by the report, there was one report in the Financial Times that said about, the sheer racism of some of this is amazing. It said some Western participants accused the fossil fuel producers of taking advantage of their relationships with host country Egypt. Quote, "You have to ask yourself, is this an African COP or an Arab group COP?" one said. I mean, unbelievable stuff. If this was any other thing except saving the planet from global warming, you wouldn't have that kind of stuff being said.
It is fascinating, this sort of developing versus developed country narrative that we have at COP, which would seem very unusual in many other sort of international diplomatic events, but yes, there's this clear narrative, and the sort of development implications of these conferences are so important. I'm going to press on to the next question because I'm concerned we've not got that much time left, and so I want to include as many audience questions as we can. So the next one that I wanted to go to was about they introduced a Global Shield Loss and Damage Fund, 170 million euros, and some other countries contributed to this as well. And that's all about an insurance-based approach. And some people describe that as, how can we have an insurance-based approach to climate change when it was essentially uninsurable because climate change would be so bad? Professor Arima, would you like to comment on that, and perhaps whether you think sort of an insurance-based approach to the issue of climate change, which is actually grounded in realism about what the likely costs are going to be in particular areas, is that a bit more of a sort of sustainable, effective approach of dealing with this issue?
The insurance-based mechanism compared with a liability-based mechanism. Yes. Perhaps I think insurance-based mechanism could be more, workable compared with liability-based mechanism, because as Mario said, it is utterly impossible to prove causability between extreme weather and the climate change. So maybe I think the TOR of the or governance of the loss and damage fund is to be discussed from now. So maybe that could be also discussed as one option, but nobody knows because it is just the beginning of the discussion. And then since the recommendation is to be worked out by consensus by 24 people, 10 from developed and 14 from developing countries. So I don't know how the final outcome could be worked out.
Thank you. And Mario, would you like to comment on any of that?
No, I'll try to leave as much time for the other questions as possible.
Excellent. So if we go on to our next question from Hugh Sharman, he said, Finland's Geological Survey's latest publication by Professor Simon Michaud seems to show that the mineral requirements deemed as essential by the IEA in their 2021 publication, The Role of Critical Minerals in the Clean Energy Transition, are far in excess of the ability of our world to deliver these, let alone ESG compliantly. Their study indicates that there cannot possibly be a net zero energy policy that can possibly be delivered. What would you say to that?
So I will just say that if you look at, so calculate it this way, okay? The studies that I've seen sort of across the board, looking at, say, the dozen most prominent studies, talk about on the order of 500 gigawatts of solar power plants would be required in the United States to achieve net zero by whatever date you like. That is, if you calculate it out on some basic assumptions, a big utility scale solar project is about 500 megawatts. That's about 2,000, 5,000, 7,000 acres. This is an area the size of the state of New Jersey covered in solar panels from one end to the other. And that's an incredible amount of territory. If the batteries involved are going to require huge leach fields. I don't know if you've ever seen the leach fields for lithium-ion batteries, but birds die within a second or two of alighting anywhere on this stuff. It's incredibly toxic. So these are catastrophic level environmental consequences, environmental impacts from an energy transition that in the end is supposed to be the whole justification for this energy transition is supposed to be to avoid a marginal set of marginally worse environmental impacts. And the total lack of even an attempt to do a cost benefit analysis here or contend with the realities of what they're talking about, it can't be put off forever. It can't be put off forever because if people are willing to listen to you when gasoline is $2 a gallon in the United States. People are willing to listen to ambitious clean energy kinds of things. But when gasoline is $4 or $5 a gallon and you've just put fossil fuels at the top of everyone's hierarchy of needs, and it's a traumatizing experience to every time you go to the gasoline station, people are not going to listen to you about this stuff anymore. And so I think that a lot of the positions that have been taken by the US delegation and the EU delegation, and you can see this as a consistent pattern over the past 2 years by the Biden administration, is just kind of throwing up their hands and trying to at least maximize the political benefit of the stuff, because I think that people here and there within the administration, at least in the United States, are starting to realize that a lot of this is just physically impossible.
Thank you, Mario. That leads me on, I think, quite nicely to a question from Steve Jones, who says, everybody is in favor of fighting climate change on a Sunday night and after watching an Attenborough propaganda film, and politicians have fed off this warm feeling as long as somebody else is paying. But what will that feeling so easily turn into real personal taxes being sent overseas to developing countries as a woke guilt trip for the Industrial Revolution? And I think that sort of crystallizes a feeling that actually what the world leaders are talking about at COP27 and the people who've been sent there to negotiate on their behalf, loss and damage in particular, is not something that actually will play very well necessarily with local people in developed countries who are actually struggling to meet energy costs and rising inflation crisis. So, Rupert, how detached do you think, the negotiators of the UK in particular, but generally for Western countries, are from their actual electorates?
Well, I thought it was quite interesting because when Rishi Sunak justified it, he used those words because it's the right thing to do. And when a politician says it's the right thing to do, they don't have a real explanation for what they're doing. But I have to say, I slightly push back. The loss and damages stuff is the most visible, but really for a country like Britain, sort of quite, fairly far north on the eastern side of the Atlantic, having western weather systems coming off the Atlantic blowing at us, it is quite plausible that Britain is a gainer from mild climate change. There has never been a cost-benefit analysis of decarbonisation for Britain. It's always been done of what the benefit would be for the world as a whole. And when you look at it that way, you realise that decarbonisation, net zero, is for the benefit of the global south, if you like. It's not for the benefit of people in Britain. It's going to cost them a huge amount. So the stuff about loss and damages and adaptation and the $100 billion annual Britain's contribution to the 100 billion, that's all the biggest cost, and the biggest transfer of benefit is actually from Britain decarbonising and giving this benefit to the rest of the world, which incidentally the rest of the world puts very little value on.
Yeah, and I'll just jump in and say one other thing along those lines, which is something that I tell students, which is that when it comes to the social cost of carbon, be careful what you wish for. Because you may find that the social cost of carbon, if you really do an objective analysis, is negative.
Thank you, Mario. I think that nicely links in with this question from Alex Mayhook Walker, who says, why is this process totally detached from empirical data? So, Jun, perhaps I could ask you what your answer to that question would be, and also what do you think are the most important pieces of data that negotiators and world leaders should be understanding to come to better climate change policies and that the public should be aware of?
Yeah, and a problem is, if you read through thousands of pages of IPCC report, there are many good data, but quite often politicians only read summary for policymakers, and summary for policymakers are negotiated by professional negotiators. So that is a very much political document. And pick and choose the convenient data or convenient, say, narrative from a very thick IPCC report. And that dominate the discussion in the negotiation. And they quite often say that this is the verdict by the science. But we have never seen the actual wording of existential threat or climate crisis or something, as Richard Koonin said in his publication. So it is very much dramatized by media and also environmental activists. And unfortunately, in this process is something like the annual pilgrim by environmentalists to the venue of the COP, and it is something like the trade show of their activities. So perhaps I think the realistic argument is very much difficult to be applied in this fora. So I have been negotiating in this fora many years, but I'm increasingly despaired by the ongoing eco-fundamentalism prevailing in this fora.
And can I just add to that real quick? I think that one of the things that both the National Assessment Report that's prepared by the United States and the IPCC have in common is that they elide, in this packaging of the summary for policymakers, they elide areas where the science still shows considerable uncertainty about what the climate impacts are. and uncertainty that is really fatal to some of the policy prescriptions that are being proposed. And now uncertainty is not necessarily incompatible with a policy of precaution, but you have to take uncertainty into account in a rational way. It's still, uncertainty doesn't mean that you throw cost-benefit analysis out the window. It means that you have to treat it a certain way. And if you read, after 6 assessment reports, we're still getting that the equilibrium climate sensitivity impact of doubling carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is somewhere between 1 degree Celsius and 5 degrees Celsius. We already knew that without reading any science, right? It's somewhere between not that big of a deal and serious warming. I mean, if that's, we're still in the same place that we were 20 years ago, right? On some of the most fundamental scientific questions. And so I think it's very important for people to be alert to the fact that, as Professor Arima says, this stuff is being packaged in a very political way, and that considerable uncertainty remains about the most important questions from the point of view of climate policy, and appeals to scientific authority do not solve, as we just saw in this pandemic, appeals to scientific authority do not solve the problems that are fundamentally problems of public choice, where the public is the one that ultimately, in a democracy at least, has to decide how to weigh various priorities against each other.
Thank you, Mario. Rupert, do you want to come in there with some last words? And then I'm afraid I have to wrap things up.
Yeah, thanks very much, Harry. The data I would lay on the table is the emissions data, that simply that emissions have carried on growing, and indeed they've accelerated. Around 2002, they actually accelerated. The growth of emissions accelerated as the balance of emissions shifted from Western nations to developing nations, and because they're growing faster, therefore using. So this process has failed. It has objectively failed, and the idea that emissions are going to peak in 3 years' time, or it's just crazy. It's crazy talk. It's delusion. And so I would just say, if you're really concerned about carbon dioxide emissions, you need a different approach. And the fundamental failure of this approach was to target quantities rather than prices. Economists will say you should target prices. You put on you internalize the externality by putting a price on it, and that was the way that they should have gone. That's the way conceivably they could do, but it would mean admitting that this whole process has failed.
Thank you, Rupert. And I'm sure we could have a long debate about carbon taxes, but maybe for another time. But I think one thing I would conclude from our fascinating discussion today has just been, actually, there's this huge disconnect between the reality and the kind of language that we hear at COP26, and future conferences will run into increasing difficulties as the democratic realities, the scientific realities, and the political realities collide with the rhetoric that we've been hearing. So finally, just a huge thank you to our excellent panelists. It's been a really great conversation. It's been great to hear your insight. Thank you to all our viewers as well for your questions, which have facilitated our conversation today. So see you all again next time for another webinar in the future, and good evening, good morning, good afternoon, wherever it is where you are today. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.